Okay, it's a couple hours later and we're back. Where was I? Alan Moore taking over Swamp Thing, yes. Now, Alan Moore's take on the concept was quite interesting and quite different and quite unique, quite frankly. Quite. Whereas the original version of the character was Alec Holland had been transformed into the Swamp Thing in the very first proper Alan Moore issue, namely issue 21 of Saga of the Swamp Thing. We discover that that's not actually what Swamp Thing is. In the very first issue of Swamp Thing, the original, apparently Alec Holland died. And it was not that he had been transformed into Swamp Thing, but rather that the swamp became Alec Holland. The swamp matter surrounding his flaming chemical-doused body reformed into a humanoid creature that thought it was Alec Holland turned into the Swamp Thing. Think about that for a minute. So basically what we have here is a living, thinking, humanoid plant, microwave, that thought it was a human turned into a plant creature, but was in fact itself a plant creature that had actually absorbed the residual consciousness and mind of Alec Holland from his dead body. So Alec Holland's actually been dead this whole time. So he can never become human again because Swamp Thing was never human to begin with. So that's essentially where Alan Moore's take on the Swamp Thing saga begins. And he continued his run for about 45 issues. It was a pretty solid run. I mean, that was over almost 4 years he wrote Swamp Thing. Now, Alan Moore's entire run is actually collected together. Oh, hold on, let's get them chronological here. Collected together in 6 trade paperback volumes. This is the whole set. Let me give you a look at the covers here. Originally, issue number 20, I mentioned this in my graphic novel overview, issue 20 was not actually included in the reprints because it was generally considered that issue 21 was where Alan Moore's proper run began. Issue 20 was basically just, I mean, yes, it was his first issue, but it was basically just him tying up Martin Pasco's storylines to carry on in his own direction. So this is volume 1. This has recently been reprinted yet again. It's been reprinted a few times, but the latest edition is a really nice hardcover edition that actually does include issue 20. But that's why I originally tracked down issue 20, was so that I could have the full, complete run of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, just to, because I'm a completist that way. So why haven't I gotten all the other back issues yet? Well, just haven't got around to it. It's pretty high on my priority list of comics to get. So that's volume 1, and then we have volume 2. Now, as the saga evolved during Alan Moore's run, it really went off in some interesting directions. I should mention, some of you may be familiar with the character John Constantine from the Hellblazer comics, or from the Keanu Reeves movie, which I still haven't seen, actually. John Constantine actually originally first appeared as a recurring character in Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. So if you want to know where Constantine started, you might want to check out Swamp Thing. Now, Swamp Thing was also one of the first comics to be a part of DC's Vertigo line. It's basically their line of adult comics. And for the most part, the Vertigo line is self-contained series, but there is some crossing over from time to time. And it actually is a part of the DC universe as well, like just the general DC universe. As a matter of fact, in some of the earlier Alan Moore issues, the Justice League appears, Batman appears a few times, and like that. So it's pretty cool, but it's definitely slightly darker interpretations of the classic DC characters when they appear here. Even Sandman, Neil Gaiman's Sandman, has made reference to events from Swamp Thing from time to time. And as a matter of fact, some of there's one of the serial killers that appears in the Doll's House story arc originally appeared in an issue of Swamp Thing. So it's quite interesting. Because I'd read Sandman before, it was interesting for me to go back to Swamp Thing and actually see the origins of that character. Now, the thing that makes Alan Moore's take on Swamp Thing interesting is it stays true to the horror roots of the character. I mean, it's still very much a horror comic in that there's a lot of things that happen in it that are, quite frankly, quite disturbing. The Vertigo line generally seems to be very horror-oriented. You'll notice a lot of the comics in there, like Hellblazer, is very horror-oriented. Sandman, while Sandman is essentially a fairy tale for adults, it also has a lot of genuinely, horrific elements to it from time to time. Some of the early stories, especially, were very horror-oriented. So while Alan Moore does stay true to the horror roots in his run and really has some unique takes on what constitutes horror, there's some really interesting ideas in there, he also expands the boundaries of what was possible with the character. As the story evolves and you learn more about what Swamp Thing actually is, it only starts with the whole idea of it being a sentient plant creature and not actually being a human who's been transformed into a plant creature. That's just the beginning of it. That's just the tip of the iceberg. It gets so much deeper and so much more interesting as it goes. It's really quite an epic tale. I mean, it's very much a modern myth in many ways, just the way it evolves. I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to give it away for you. I want you to, if I've hopefully piqued your interest, some of you at least, that you'll go out and read it for yourself and then experience it for the first time, much as I did reading through the graphic novels. And it's just such an amazing experience. If you enjoy just a quality horror story, if you enjoy epic tales of, supernatural things, or if you just enjoy a really good story, if you're a fan of Alan Moore's other stuff, I cannot possibly recommend Swamp Thing highly enough. Even if you don't check out any of the other incarnations of it, I also recommend the original. At the very least, pick up Dark Genesis just to see the origins of the character. And Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson did some great work on this. It's really, really classic stuff. But even if you don't check out the other incarnations of Swamp Thing, definitely check out Alan Moore's run on it, because it's just an absolutely spectacular story that you will never forget, and a worthy member of the Vertigo library. After Alan Moore's run, another notable comic writer and artist by the name of Rick Veatch took over. Rick Veatch I was familiar with actually from some of his work with Marvel's Epic Comics. He did a mini-series called The One, which was quite good. It was a 6-issue limited series. Not many people know that one, but it was quite good. I really enjoyed it, actually. It was very twisted, kind of a Reagan-era paranoia of nuclear holocaust, near-future kind of story with some really interesting twists. And honestly, the type of stories that Rick Veatch tends to do, he's a very good artist and storyteller. As a matter of fact, he started on Swamp Thing as an artist and occasional guest writer. He wrote some of the 1 or 2 issues towards the end of Alan Moore's run. I guess Alan Moore was gearing up to move on to other things. And he was quite a worthy successor to Alan Moore, because he very much continued the same thread of ideas, and I think it was very smart for him to be the one to take over, because when Alan Moore did his run on Swamp Thing, it was just so critically acclaimed. I mean, he ended up with some pretty big shoes to fill by the end of it. And I think Rick Veatch did a great job. I haven't read a lot of Rick Veatch's stories which follow, but I have read bits and pieces, and I'm somewhat familiar with some of the main storylines that carry on there just from reading about Swamp Thing online in various forums and stuff. And yeah, can't wait. There actually are 3 volumes of Rick Veatch's stories. I don't know how long his total run was, but volumes 7, 8, and 9, which continue right from the end of book 6 of Alan Moore's run, basically continue the reprints. I don't know how far they're going to go with it, but there's been a lot of different incarnations of Swamp Thing over the years. I mean, as the work that Alan Moore did was successful in revamping the character and in many ways reinventing modern comics and the way we think about horror comics and just comics in general. I mean, he really broke a lot of new ground with Swamp Thing. It wasn't just that he had revamped this character. He had shown that comic book stories could be intelligent and deep and thought-provoking just as much as any other medium. Prior to that, they really, you know, with a few exceptions, they really weren't. They were pretty straightforward, simplistic stories. But Alan Moore brought a level of depth to the story, to what was originally just a straight-ahead horror comic, and really did some amazing things with it. And again, I really don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil the surprises for you. I want you to be able to experience it as fresh as possible. Now, after the run of Saga of the Swamp Thing, it has come back a few times in, I think, another regular series and some limited-length series. I don't have any of the later versions. My primary focus on Swamp Thing has been the, I guess, the most critically acclaimed era. I just think the stories are so fascinating and interesting. The artwork is great. They did some really great work. You know, how Bernie Wrightson did the artwork on the original, and he's just one of the all-time great comic book artists ever. Stephen Bissette and John Totleben and Rick Veatch did some of the, you know, carried on that tradition with some absolutely fantastic artwork, far beyond what you typically saw in 80s and 90s comics at the time. Just the level of detail was fantastic, and it really helped pave the way for, you know, the type of artwork that we often see in modern comics now. And yeah, so if you're looking at one of the most influential comics of the past 20 years, and sort of what helped to form our, you know, interpretation of the way comics should be now, look no further than Swamp Thing. There's been a few other adaptations over the years. There was, of course, the movie, which spawned a sequel 7 years later, 1989. The second movie is very tongue-in-cheek. It's far less, you know, as I mentioned, the first movie was pretty straightforward and more or less a serious take on the subject matter, straight adaptation of the comics. The Return of the Swamp Thing, while it's a fun movie, is very tongue-in-cheek and very cheesy. Then a few years after that, they actually did a live-action TV series, which ran for 3 seasons and I believe 72 episodes, if I remember correctly. This is the first volume. There is a second volume available from good old folks at good old Shout Factory. The third volume, which would wrap up the series, is actually in limbo right now. No idea when or if that's coming out. The TV series isn't bad. Yeah, it's fun. I like it. But it's very different from the comics, because by this point, the comics were well into the Alan Moore era. In fact, I think the Alan Moore era had ended by the time this series came out. So while the movie was just based on the original comics, because that's all there was at the time, by this point there was a lot more Swamp Thing, a lot more, I guess, cerebral Swamp Thing out there, and they still kind of stuck to the original roots with the series. It's got much more the flavor of the original comics rather than the revamped comics of later years. But it's still a lot of fun. I mean, it's good stuff. If you like the comics, I'm sure you'll find something to enjoy in the movies and the series. At the very least, I recommend checking out the first movie, the Wes Craven one, because it's a lot of fun. Alrighty, so I guess that's about it. Oh, actually, one other thing I found just going through some of my magazines, I found I have an old issue of the Comics Journal, which featured no less than about a 50-page segment of interviews all about Swamp Thing, where they actually interview Alan Moore, Stephen Bissette, and John Totleben, who were the original creative team on Alan Moore's run. And it's pretty interesting. At this point, he had only been doing the comic for about a year, and it was really fascinating to hear his insights at that early stage. You know, because as I say, this was his first major American comic book work, and he really was pretty unknown over here until he did his run on Swamp Thing, and then now, of course, he's considered the stuff of legend. There you go, Swamp Thing. Do I recommend it? Definitely. If you like horror, if you like good stories, if you like Alan Moore, check it out. You won't be disappointed. It's great stuff. Just before we go, I wanted to mention there was a couple of reasons why I decided to cover Swamp Thing right now in particular. First off, of course, it's part of the Halloween Fest. I was planning to do it anyway. But the other reason was right after I filmed, actually the same day and literally within minutes of sitting down to start capturing and editing the footage of my previous comic book video, the graphic novel Shelf, I heard some unfortunate news, namely that Dick Durock, the guy who played Swamp Thing in both movies and in the TV series, passed away at the age of 72 after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. So, yeah, Dick Durock had quite a lengthy career. He did a lot of television and film work. He was a stuntman for a while, but I think most fans will always remember him as the definitive live-action Swamp Thing. I mean, he did a great job portraying the character, and I know from interviews and such, it was a character that he always really enjoyed playing, and that was very special to him. And he will be missed. So that was another reason why I wanted to do Swamp Thing now, was as kind of my little tribute to Dick Durock. He will be missed. He will be missed. Alrighty, well that's it from me to you for now. So until next time, sayonara.